Hello, I'm Barbara. And my own father took my villa and handed it over to my sister's in-laws. He said, "It's theirs, not yours." I watched as my family laughed, smirked, and erased my place, step by step. How could the people I trusted most betray me so completely? What would I do when the very ground beneath me was stolen, and my life rewritten without a warning? The drive to the villa stretched longer than I expected, 2 hours of open road flanked by the fading green of late spring Texas. The sun hung low, casting a golden haze over the small town streets I passed, each turn reminding me of summers spent here, when my mother's laughter filled the air and the lake shimmered under our careless afternoons. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, not from fear, but from that strange mixture of nostalgia and a quiet anxiety, knowing that the place I once called home was no longer entirely mine. The memory of her gentle guidance, teaching me the meaning of loyalty and integrity, clung to me, bringing both warmth and a pang of vulnerability. Every mile I covered carried me closer to the villa, but also closer to an uncertainty that prickled at the edges of my thoughts. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the familiar outline of the villa appeared, and I noticed immediately the subtle changes around it. A new coat of paint here, the garden trimmed differently, the faint sound of voices carrying from the porch. I parked the car and took a deep breath before stepping out, letting the scent of the warm evening settle around me. Trula and her parents were there, casually sipping wine, laughing as though the house had always belonged solely to them. My name, absent from any notes or guest lists, hit me first as a cold, sharp reminder. The villa, my family's legacy, was now treated as if it belonged entirely to them, erasing my presence, my role, my claim. I felt the familiar sting of hurt, a quiet rage simmering beneath the surface, coupled with a sense of invisibility that was hard to swallow. I walked up to the porch with measured steps, greeting my father and Trula politely, my words careful, betraying nothing of the storm brewing inside me. My eyes swept the surroundings, noting every detail: a vase that once sat on my mother's table, now claimed by someone else, a photo subtly shifted out of view. Then I noticed the letters, my mother's letters, removed or hidden. My pulse quickened. The realization of deliberate concealment struck me deeper than I expected, yet I maintained my calm exterior, masking frustration with a soft, composed smile. I weighed every option in my mind, assessing the power dynamics without giving the slightest indication of the strategy forming in the back of my head. Once inside, I paused in the living room, letting my gaze roam across the familiar yet altered interior. My thoughts drifted, first to my mother, then to the decisions my father had made, and finally to what lay ahead. Memories instilled a moral grounding that felt heavier tonight, urging patience, observation, and calculated action. I recognized the quiet betrayal, but I also recognized my own capacity to reclaim what was rightfully mine. My emotions coiled into determination, a silent promise that I would not be overlooked, nor would the legacy of my family be diminished. I remained outwardly calm, internalizing every detail, every shift, every look, planning the moment to act when the time was right. Then, a jarring detail caught my eye. A personal item of mine, moved and seemingly claimed by Trula, signaling an unmistakable intent to erase me further. Anger flared, interlaced with disbelief and a growing resolve. It was subtle, but the message was clear. I inhaled slowly, steadying my thoughts. The villa, the place that held my childhood, my memories, and my mother's guidance, was no longer merely a home, it was a battleground. And I intended to navigate it with the clarity, patience, and intelligence that my years of experience had taught me. As I stepped further into the villa, the quiet hum of the early evening wrapped around me, almost masking the tension that had settled in my chest. Each room felt familiar, yet disturbingly different, as though the walls themselves had conspired to rewrite history without my consent. The living room bore subtle alterations. A photograph slightly angled away from its original place, a chair shifted a few inches, items that once carried my mother's touch, now claimed by someone else. A wave of unease passed over me, accompanied by a faint anger that simmered beneath a composed exterior. I walked slowly, letting my gaze linger, noting every small detail that hinted at an orchestrated marginalization. These were not random changes. They were carefully curated signals that my presence here was no longer acknowledged. Moving into the study, I opened the old cabinet and found something that made my stomach tighten. A family video, once a collection of our shared summers, carefully edited to remove my appearances entirely. Each familiar laugh, each memory, had been pruned, leaving a version of my past where I scarcely existed. Shock and disbelief collided with a rising frustration, my mind racing through the moments I had cherished. Barbecues by the lake, late-night card games, my mother's voice echoing wisdom through the house. I sank into a nearby chair, taking a slow breath to steady myself, feeling the sting of invisibility mixed with the cold calculation forming in the back of my mind. I could not allow this erasure to go unchallenged. As I rifled through papers on the desk, my hands froze on a set of villa documents subtly altered. Ownership details and legacy notes shifted, traces of Romy's interference apparent in the careful handwriting and discreet corrections. I recognized the pattern. Trula had been quietly asserting control, leveraging both my father's passive approval and the household staff's silent compliance. The anger that surged was tempered by the careful mental calculus I had practiced for years. Observe, record, understand before acting. My mind worked through possibilities, noting the small telltale signs of overconfidence among the staff who underestimated my awareness. I retreated to the corner of the room, letting my eyes skim over the villa, absorbing the changes and the implications. Memories of my mother's lessons, integrity, patience, strategic thinking, resonated strongly. I reassured myself silently that my rightful place could not be erased by manipulation or deceit. A quiet determination formed, an internal promise to reclaim what was mine, using intellect and subtlety rather than open confrontation. I began plotting how to gather evidence, anticipate their next moves, and maintain control over my own actions without betraying my composure. By the time I reached the hallway, the sun had dipped lower, shadows stretching along the polished floors. My gaze fell on a folder tucked inconspicuously in a drawer, the contents hinting at legal ramifications that could either bolster or challenge my position regarding the villa. My pulse quickened with a mix of anticipation, frustration, and resolve. The battle for recognition, for the preservation of my family's legacy, had only just begun, and I understood with clarity that every step needed precision, every word weighed, every observation meticulously noted. I would not allow this calculated erasure to define my presence or my actions. The evening air seemed charged with possibility, each breath reminding me that the villa, though altered, was still my ground, and I would navigate it with patience and intelligence, quietly preparing for the moment to act. Walking through the villa that evening, I felt the weight of each subtle change pressing on me. The chairs weren't quite where I remembered them, small personal mementos nudged aside, photographs angled differently. These weren't accidental adjustments. They were deliberate, a silent declaration that my presence no longer mattered. My mind flicked through years of family patterns, moments where my voice had been muted or my existence sidelined. I traced the path from the living room to the study with deliberate steps, cataloging every detail and weighing each implication. It was clear I could not react rashly. The situation demanded observation, strategy, and careful leverage. I mentally listed the witnesses I could rely on, the small but crucial points of power that could turn this tide in my favor. Anger simmered beneath a calm surface, tempered by the recognition that a controlled mind would outmaneuver raw emotion. I paused at the desk, noting inconsistencies in villa logs and the subtle rearrangement of schedules that signaled intentional exclusion. A minor staff member, unaware of my attention, let slip a mention of Trula directing changes to documents and guest lists. It was a small comment, barely audible, yet it revealed the orchestration behind the scenes. Trula manipulating details while relying on my father's neutral stance to avoid confrontation. I moved quietly, recording these signs mentally, absorbing the environment and the patterns of control. My indignation was steady, mingled with a sense of intellectual engagement as I assessed every subtle cue. Each glance, each gesture, Each whispered word added to the mosaic of evidence I was piecing together. When I finally addressed Trula, I chose a measured approach. I spoke of villa alterations and missing mementos in a tone calm enough to mask my inner fire, but firm enough to assert authority. Trula's reaction, sharp and defensive, hinted at her deeper motives, her desire to control not just the property, but the narrative of our family. I watched my father closely, noting his subtle shifts, the alignment or hesitation that would indicate where loyalties might lie. I let the conversation unfold deliberately, testing boundaries, gauging reactions. Beneath the surface, I cataloged weaknesses, oversights, and openings that I could exploit later. The tension in the room was palpable, a quiet storm of strategy and suppressed anger, each word and movement carrying calculated weight. Retreating to a corner afterward, I let myself process the encounter. Patterns of favoritism, of exclusion throughout my life, crystallized into understanding. The sting of betrayal transformed into a quiet resolve, a commitment to reclaim agency over my family legacy. I reminded myself of the lessons my mother had imparted, the importance of patience, composure, and strategic action. Every slight, every act of erasure had only strengthened my determination to navigate this environment with intelligence and foresight. I would not allow them to dictate my place in the family or erase the contributions I had made. As the evening shadows deepened, my eyes caught a small, folded note tucked in a drawer, hastily written but deliberate. The contents hinted at Trula's next moves, her ongoing attempts to solidify control over both villa and family perception. My pulse quickened at the implications, a mixture of anticipation, frustration, and focus. I understood that the confrontation was far from over, and that the battle for recognition, for the truth of my place, and the preservation of my family's story had only just begun. Every move I would make from this point required precision, observation, and patience. The villa, though quietly contested, remained my ground, and I would navigate it with steady determination, preparing for the inevitable escalation that lay ahead. The villa seemed quieter than usual that evening, the kind of stillness that made every subtle movement feel amplified. As I entered the dining room, I noticed the slight rearrangements that Trula had made. Chairs pulled closer to her side of the table, family heirlooms subtly shifted, schedules posted where they would reinforce her presence. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with awareness. This was no casual oversight. Every detail spoke to a deliberate assertion of dominance, a careful orchestration to make me feel sidelined. I surveyed the room with a measured eye, noting the staff's hesitant glances, the unspoken tension hanging like a curtain between us. I reminded myself to remain composed. This was the first step in testing the waters, asserting boundaries without sparking a direct confrontation. I waited for a moment during the family conversation, choosing my words with deliberate care. "It's important that everyone feels recognized for their contributions," I said, my voice calm but firm. "There are traditions here that belong to all of us, and we must respect them." Trula's eyes flicked toward me, her expression momentarily faltering as she registered the implicit warning. I continued, emphasizing balance and fairness, making no overt accusation but leaving no room for misinterpretation. My father, seated quietly at the head of the table, gave no sign of intervention, his neutrality a reminder that I had to rely on my own tact and composure. Inside, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. The message had landed. I had planted the seed of caution, asserting moral authority while maintaining outward calm. Trula's response was cautious, almost defensive, yet she did not escalate. A subtle tension lingered, visible in the way she adjusted an heirloom on the mantel, her hands betraying a fleeting awareness of my presence. Minor staff members shifted slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of the changing dynamics. I observed it all, cataloging behaviors and vulnerabilities, noting where her confidence wavered. This was a chess game, and each move counted. My restraint contrasted with her tentative reactions, strengthening my sense of strategic advantage. The villa, once a familiar backdrop, had become a landscape of subtle power plays, and I was learning its contours with precision. Later, in the quiet of the library, I reviewed notes and observations, piecing together a mental map of control and influence. I considered Trula's patterns, the timing of her actions, the small, almost imperceptible nudges that reinforced her authority. My reflection was steady, guided by both moral clarity and tactical foresight. I reminded myself that patience was part of power, and that measured action often carried more weight than impulsive confrontation. Each calculated thought reinforced my resolve, the determination to reclaim agency and assert my rightful place in the family and villa. As I looked up from my notes, I caught a subtle gesture from Trula, a deliberate, almost taunting adjustment of a framed photograph. My heart tightened, a mix of anticipation and focused determination. This was her first response to my warning, and it signaled that the challenge was far from over. I could sense the tension rising, the need for careful, calculated countermeasures growing clearer with every passing moment. The evening had shifted from quiet observation to strategic engagement, and I understood that the coming days would demand vigilance, intelligence, and a steadfast commitment to protecting what was rightfully mine. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the veranda, casting long shadows across the living room, where Trula had been quietly rearranging decorative objects. I had been observing the subtle shifts for some time, noting how chairs were positioned to favor her presence, how personal items I had long cared for were slowly being claimed or relocated, and how Romy seemed to follow her lead with unthinking obedience. The villa had become a stage for quiet power plays, and I could feel the tension building with each deliberate adjustment. My mind traced back over years of subtle favoritism, of small erasures and overlooked contributions, and I felt a familiar sense of frustration rising. But this time, it was tempered with careful calculation. I knew it was time to step forward, to mark my presence unmistakably, and to make clear that boundaries existed and would be respected. Taking a deep breath, I began to gather the words I would use, measuring their impact and tone. The challenge was to assert authority without igniting overt conflict, to be firm yet composed, strategic yet ethically grounded. I reminded myself that my father would remain neutral, as he often had, and that I could not rely on overt support. The staff's eyes shifted subtly toward me as I paced my approach, sensing the undercurrent of tension and change. The courage to speak my mind had to come from preparation and understanding of the dynamics at play. I rehearsed the phrasing in my head, carefully selecting language that communicated both moral clarity and the inevitability of consequences for overstepping. I felt a mix of determination and cautious apprehension, knowing the moment of assertion was near and that it could not be delayed further. Finally, as the room settled into a temporary stillness, I addressed Trula with calm, deliberate authority. Trula, I need to remind everyone that these spaces, these possessions, carry meaning for all members of our family. It's important that we honor the history and contributions of each person here, I said, my voice measured, steady, and unmistakable in its intent. Her posture stiffened, a flicker of unease crossing her features, and I noted the hesitation in her speech as she replied in clipped, careful tones. Romy's glance toward her was almost imperceptible, but I could sense the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the balance of influence tilting, ever so slightly, in my favor. I allowed a moment for the weight of my words to register, maintaining calm defiance while observing every micro-reaction. Afterward, I withdrew to a quiet corner of the veranda, assessing the effectiveness of my intervention. I cataloged the reactions, noting areas where Trula had faltered and where the staff had shown awareness of the new dynamics. My mind worked through the implications for long-term strategy, considering the steps I would need to take should my warning be ignored. The satisfaction of having asserted boundaries without resorting to anger or confrontation bolstered my resolve. I felt a quiet empowerment, an understanding that I could influence the villa's environment with intellect, composure, and moral clarity. The situation was far from resolved, but I had planted the first unmistakable marker of my authority. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the veranda, I noticed a subtle, provocative glance from Trula, a nearly imperceptible smirk as she moved an heirloom slightly, as if to test whether my warning held weight. My pulse quickened, and I realized that this was only the beginning. She was assessing my resolve, and the true measure of the battle for influence and respect within the villa had yet to be revealed. I steadied myself, determined to remain vigilant and strategic, ready for the escalation I knew was coming. Every detail mattered now. Every move could signal power, defiance, or submission. And I would be ready to respond. The villa felt charged that afternoon, the quiet hum of the air conditioning contrasting with the subtle but deliberate shifts around me. Chairs had been moved, ornaments nudged slightly, and personal items, once carefully arranged, had been borrowed or subtly relocated. Trula's presence was increasingly assertive, her gaze sweeping over the rooms with quiet ownership, while Romy shadowed her every move, offering a compliant smile that barely concealed calculation. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, a mixture of alarm and rising frustration. But there was also clarity. I could not allow these encroachments to go unchecked. Each minor adjustment, each silent claim of space, was a test, and I would meet it with deliberate, calculated action. I moved purposefully, observing the smallest gestures, cataloging the shifts, and assessing the consequences of inaction. The villa, once a shared sanctuary of memory and history, was being quietly wrested away under the guise of casual behavior. My mind raced, weighing social perception against the need to assert control. Every decision I made now would ripple outward. Every response would signal strength, weakness, or hesitation. I gathered my thoughts, rehearsing measured words and subtle gestures that could mark boundaries without creating a spectacle, all the while anticipating Trula's likely reactions and potential counters. When the moment came, I acted. Calmly, with precise articulation, I reasserted my space, rearranging items and reclaiming areas with a quiet authority that spoke volumes. Trula's posture shifted instantly, a hint of discomfort, a fleeting hesitation in her voice, while Romy's composure faltered just enough for me to note. The staff's eyes flicked toward the subtle exchange, sensing the undercurrent of tension. Each movement, each deliberate action, was a carefully placed chess piece, signaling that boundaries were not to be ignored. My own pulse steadied, pride swelling in the knowledge that I could confront without fury, that I could claim presence and authority through intelligence and composure alone. I considered Trula's likely next steps, anticipating escalation, and mapped potential responses in my mind. Previous patterns of manipulation provided clues. I identified triggers, tendencies, and likely maneuvers. My strategy involved patience, observation, and preemptive adjustments, controlling not only my reaction, but shaping the environment to maintain an upper hand. In that quiet, tense space, I felt empowered, grounded in both moral clarity and strategic foresight. Then came the bold move. Trula crossed a line I had subtly marked. A gesture, a claim over a key item, signaling deliberate defiance. Immediate consequences were necessary. I intervened with precision, asserting authority without confrontation, reclaiming both object and principle. Father's silent acknowledgement of the shift in dynamics underscored the changing balance. The villa, for a moment, held its collective breath, the subtle power play evident in every glance and hesitation. Satisfaction mingled with tension. The victory was quiet but unmistakable, yet the battle was far from over. As shadows lengthened across the veranda and the evening air cooled, I sensed the larger game taking shape. Trula's boldness, Romy's complicity, and the staff's wary attention indicated that the conflict was only escalating. I knew this was the turning point. Calculated action now would define the trajectory of the struggle for control, memory, and respect within the villa. Every detail mattered. Every move required foresight, patience, and unwavering resolve. The real challenge had just begun. The late afternoon light filtered through the villa windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors, and I felt the air thick with possibility. Each moment since Trula's latest overstep had been carefully logged in my mind, patterns identified, and opportunities noted. I traced back through the incidents, the subtle shifts in seating, the appropriation of spaces, the quiet manipulations that had gone unnoticed by others. With each observation, a strategy began to take shape. I assessed the weaknesses in Trula's network of influence, the predictable responses of her accomplice Romy, and the staff members quietly leaning toward fairness. Everything had a pattern, everything a consequence, and I was ready to act within those parameters. My determination was calm, methodical, and focused. No impulsive flair would compromise the calculated course I had set. I began with small victories, claiming spaces that had been encroached upon, adjusting displays and arranging areas to quietly assert authority without confrontation. Trula and Rami noticed, their eyes flickering with doubt, subtle unease creeping into gestures that once radiated dominance. The staff, discreet but observant, began to shift in small ways, offering tacit acknowledgement, a quiet support that would not betray their own position. Each maneuver reinforced my confidence, a gradual reclamation of both the physical villa and the psychological ground that had been slipping away. There was a satisfaction in the subtlety, the quiet triumphs that spoke louder than words, as power began to recalibrate in the villa's rooms. In the midst of these adjustments, I uncovered evidence of Trula's long-term manipulations, a hidden document, a secret agreement carefully buried, revealing the extent of her attempts to control not just space, but perception and legacy. I considered the timing, the risk of exposure, and the tactical advantage in waiting. My mind raced through possible reactions, aligning them with potential countermeasures. Anticipation mingled with a quiet satisfaction. I was seeing the structure of her plan, and it made the next moves clear. Every decision now was deliberate, informed by both strategy and moral clarity, each step setting the stage for a controlled, decisive impact. As evening approached, I positioned myself and my allies with careful precision, each element aligned for maximum effect. Trula, unaware of the shifting dynamics, moved through the villa as if nothing had changed, her confidence a useful foil to my carefully laid groundwork. I watched her, timing each interaction, observing the subtle cues of her overconfidence. Patience was my ally, calculation my tool, and focus sharpened with every passing moment. The anticipation of the coming confrontation surged through me, not reckless excitement, but a controlled, deliberate readiness. By the time twilight settled over the lake, I sensed the imminent turning point. The plan was in motion, and Trula, oblivious, would soon face the consequences of underestimating me. The villa itself seemed to hold its breath as the pieces aligned, and I knew that the next step would redefine the balance of power. Each observation, each subtle move, had built toward this moment, and the quiet thrill of impending reclamation surged beneath my calm exterior. The stage was set, and the outcome, though not yet visible, was now firmly within the sphere of my control. I could see the pieces moving, and I knew the next step would change everything. The villa seemed to hold its breath as early evening light waned, shadows stretching across the polished floors. I could feel the culmination of all my careful planning humming beneath my skin, the subtle positioning of allies, the quiet observation of staff, the anticipation of the exact moment to strike. I stepped into the main room with measured calm, presenting the evidence I had meticulously gathered. Documents, photographs, and subtle inconsistencies lay before the assembled family and staff, and I let the silence stretch long enough for the weight to settle in. Trula's eyes flickered, a flash of unease crossing her features as she realized that the control she thought she held was slipping. Rami shuffled beside her, attempting to mask her own alarm, but the tension was palpable. Every glance, every small shift in posture confirmed that the psychological advantage had begun to shift into my favor. I revealed the manipulations, the secret agreements, the carefully orchestrated erasure of my presence, the attempts to claim authority over spaces and decisions that were rightfully mine. Murmurs rippled through the staff and family, disbelief mixing with a grudging acknowledgement of the evidence. Trula tried to deflect, to speak over the truth, but the facts were immovable. I maintained my calm, speaking with clarity and measured authority, allowing no space for doubt about who held moral and strategic ascendancy in the room. Each word, each presentation of fact reinforced the control I had quietly reclaimed, and I felt a quiet thrill of satisfaction, tempered by the awareness that the confrontation was still unfolding. Trula and Romy, desperate to recover ground, made minor last-minute maneuvers, attempts at explanation, challenges to my assertions, gestures meant to reclaim influence. I anticipated each move, blocking subtly, redirecting their attempts with quiet authority. Allies moved almost invisibly in support, reinforcing my position without overt action. The room's energy shifted palpably, the stakes felt real, the consequences immediate. I felt the satisfaction of seeing the plan come together, my strategic patience paying dividends, while the tension of anticipation kept everyone alert, eyes fixed on the unfolding reality. As the confrontation reached its peak, I enforced boundaries decisively. Trula and Rami could no longer act with impunity. The lines were clear, consequences understood. I articulated the limits of their actions, each phrase a measured assertion of authority and moral stance. The staff, watching quietly, gave subtle signs of acknowledgement. Family members registered the shift, a quiet recognition of leadership that I had earned through careful observation, strategy, and calm execution. The empowerment I felt was steady, reinforced by clarity of purpose and the satisfaction of justice enacted through intelligence rather than impulse. Even as the room settled into stunned silence, I knew the final move was yet to come. There remained an element I had not revealed, a twist that would set the stage for the ultimate resolution of the villa's power struggle. Trula's uncertainty now mirrored the strategic patience I had cultivated for months, and I sensed the long-term impact of my actions beginning to ripple outward. Every calculated step had led to this moment, and though victory had begun to feel tangible, the story was not yet finished. I could feel the tension poised on the edge of the next decisive act, and my mind raced through the possibilities for what came next. The room had quieted, but the air was electric with anticipation. The villa had finally settled into a quiet rhythm, the late evening casting a soft glow over polished floors and familiar furniture. I walked through the main room, noticing how the subtle shifts of the past months had solidified into a new order. Trula and Rami lingered in the background, their influence diminished, their posture wary. Staff moved about with a newfound respect, small gestures acknowledging the authority I had quietly but firmly reclaimed. Family members, some hesitant, offered tentative smiles or nods, small tokens of recognition that my efforts had not gone unnoticed. A minor ally, previously cautious, approached with a discreet gesture, a handwritten note expressing support and understanding, a simple acknowledgement that felt like a quiet triumph in itself. Relief washed over me, tempered with the awareness that vigilance would always be necessary. The villa no longer felt like a stage for manipulation. It was a space where I had restored dignity and fairness, at least for now. Sitting by the veranda, I allowed myself to reflect on the journey that had led here. Years of careful observation, patience in the face of subtle betrayals, and deliberate strategic thinking had all converged into this moment. I recalled each misstep of Trula's, every quiet maneuver to marginalize or control, and realized how each one had been an opportunity to learn, to strengthen my own approach. The victories, though hard-won, were not just about authority, they were about asserting moral clarity and personal boundaries. I acknowledged a deep sense of self-validation, a recognition that patience and intelligence were often more powerful than force. The villa, once a place of tension and silent erasures, now felt like a space of renewed equilibrium, a reflection of both my perseverance and careful planning. Interactions with family revealed subtle but meaningful shifts. Conversations, once tentative or loaded with unspoken tension, carried undertones of respect. Some old grievances remained, and not every relationship could be fully repaired, but the groundwork for healthier dynamics had been laid. A previously indifferent relative offered an unexpected confession, a quiet acknowledgement of past misjudgments, reinforcing the moral closure I had sought. The villa, though still alive with human complexity, now felt less like a battleground and more like a space where dignity, intelligence, and fairness had reclaimed their place. Lessons were clear. Standing firm, acting with patience and clarity, and maintaining integrity could change not just outcomes, but relationships themselves. As the night deepened, I stepped outside onto the veranda, feeling the cool breeze of Clearview Lake brush against my face. The world beyond the villa awaited, full of its own uncertainties, yet I felt a sense of completion and hope. Not every wound had fully healed, and not every relationship was perfect, but I had moved beyond the patterns that once threatened to define me. The past had taught me vigilance, strategy, and the value of measured action. I held the evening in quiet reflection, knowing that while battles may end, the lessons last forever. The villa was no longer just a home, it was a testament to resilience, intelligence, and the quiet strength I had discovered within myself. Some stories close with fanfare, but mine closed with understanding and a life continuing, wiser and steadier than before.